Hey, episode 6. Today we have Stan on, who's a friend of mine, I suppose also co-worker.
Hello.
Yeah. So if you want to introduce yourself just quickly.
What's up? My name is Dan. I'm from Germany. I'm currently 21 years old, and I live in Hamburg. I work together with FREMZENEK. I'm a video editor, and yeah, that's how we know each other.
Yeah. So obviously I'm Zenimal Toski, Zenimal.com, the FREMZENEK podcast. So I'll just get right into it. Today we're doing social housing. I didn't introduce that. So obviously social housing is like government or or non-for-profit housing, which is generally meant to be for like low-income people or refugees or disabled people. It's meant to be accessible housing, and in the UK, especially very recently, it's actually not accessible, which is sort of a big overarching theme of this episode. But before we get into that, I'll get into some other case studies. So first of all, we have Singapore. So it's a city-state of 6.11 million people, and 80% of all their housing is social. However, it's very unique in the fact that not all the housing is rented. So most of it is lease owned, and as I explained it, there's like a buy to order scheme. So you sort of you pay into the system very slowly, and I actually discussed this on my website with my statement on pensioners. So the way that Singapore operates is they have an income tax, and then there's also almost an extension of that called the Central Provident Fund, which is a percentage of your income that the state forces you to save. And with that, as you get a job, usually you'd get a job at like 18 or maybe like post 21 with university. You'd slowly but surely build up savings with the state, and you can use that through the buy to order scheme to immediately buy a house. But there's not really ownership, which is what I explain here. So social housing is leased, right? So even though 80% of all the social housing, or 80% of all housing is social, none of it is rented and all of it is leased. And what that means is, so a 99-year lease, that's essentially your entire life. So 99 years, unless you're living to 130, you're not. It's not going to be particularly. You're not. Realistically, it's for your entire life. But because it's leased, technically the government can retain ownership once you die, and then that can be passed on to someone else, or in some cases it can be inherited. But usually it isn't, right? As I said, it just goes back to the government and they can sell it to someone else. And what that does is it consistently gives the government funds. So, for example, Singapore has the HDB, which stands for the Housing and Development Board. And what they do is they retain these funds that people from people paying into social housing, or they'll give out mortgages and then people slowly pay that off with their Central Providence Fund, or they'll just pay it off with their income if they want to pay it off earlier, and they take these funds and just build more. They're just it's basically just they're continually building and building and building, which is the big advantage of Singapore, which is incredibly impressive, as of course it's a city state, right? They're very land limited. Although you can probably tell by this map, a lot of it is there's a lot of artificial land in Singapore. So 20 to 25% of your income goes towards social housing. But this is it scales, right? As it says here. So what happens is, as your income goes up, it actually charges you more. So if you're very low income, rents can be as low as 55 Singaporean dollars a year, a month. But if you're very high income, it can be as much as 2,000 to 3,000 Singaporean dollars a year. Oh, sorry, a month. I can make this mistake. So it's roughly 20 to 25% of your income, unless you're like vastly rich, in which case it's probably like 1%. But the vast majority of the population is 20 to 25% of your income. But as I said, it scales. So even the very poor can get onto the housing ladder and own a house for a 99-year lease, or they'll just continually rent it for a very reasonable price. So Singapore is. Overall, it's quite an expensive area to live, but the housing is incredibly affordable, and that's, again, as I've explained, mostly because the government just continually builds houses, and obviously has this like Central Providence Fund and other things. So like housing is almost guaranteed, and that's because there's a huge supply, but also an equally managed demand, simply because of the fact that like people have a specific percentage of their income that goes towards housing. So demand is almost capped, right? You're not going to have a ridiculous amount of people, trying to buy into the system. And because it's social housing, obviously the supply is sort of controlled, right? You don't have these like crazy landlords buying up 200, 300 houses. of a 10, as it says, home ownership is exceeds 90%. About 10% of all housing in Singapore is privately rented, but 10% is a very, very low figure, although not
I
as
think
low as some other countries.
I think that's kind of the advantage of being like of them being a city state, because they have like less of a population to worry about, and they can really put in more care about like how they do their systems, with the way how the things are gonna work out for them.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
Singapore is like a more like a police state, right? That was the whole thing. That was the whole.
It's pretty authoritarian, right?
Yeah,
As
yeah.
I said, it's not huge. It's not like if you look at like the average price of goods on the CPI index, it's pretty unaffordable. But housing is where it really excels. Um, for all the policy reasons as I explained. So moving on to Chile. So Chile is like the polar opposite of Singapore. So where Singapore is a lot of housing is built by the government, and you know you have almost these like supply controls and these demand controls because of the fact that you know the government controls the supply and also semi controls the demand through the CPF. Chile is the exact opposite. They just subsidize demand. They're just free market, and they just keep subsidizing demand, keep giving people money, and it doesn't work because you need the supply, and there's no supply controls, right? So it's a population of 19.6 million, and social housing accounts for 0.1% of all homes. So basically no homes, and I believe most of it is for ex-military people. So almost of this 0.1%, almost all of it is ex-military. So it's not even like for for like low income people. It's almost like a military bonus. So home ownership sits at 57%, which is below Singapore, and these other countries as I'll get into. I think it's one of the lowest home ownership rates of all of these countries that I'm going through. But as it says here, it's a demand subsidy based system. So what does that mean? Basically, starting, I think it was the 80s, it might be later than that. But this is how it initially worked: is that for low income households, the state would subsidize, buying a house or subsidize the building of a new house. So they just give money to families so they could, collect funds to build a house or buy a house. So they're just subsidizing the demand. They're not building anything. They're just putting money into the housing market essentially. And what this has led to is there's 935,000 families living in overcrowded housing. There's 114,000 people living in informal slums, and there's 40,000 individuals who are homeless, which is insanely high. And that's because housing is hugely expensive. And in fact, as I explained just now, originally the subsidy was for low income housing, but low income households. But it's now actually extended to middle income households because of the fact that housing is so expensive. And it's just basic economics, right? If you subsidize demand, demand is going to extend outwards and it's going to push housing up. So now that they're subsidizing middle income households, it's only getting worse, right? Everyone is getting priced out unless you're vastly, vastly wealthy. The top 1% of all Chileans. Your housing is probably the vast majority of your income, or not the vast majority, is 27 to 28%. But that's of the people who can afford a house, right? And also, as I said, right, 935,000 families live in overcrowded housing. So even though it's 27 to 28% of your income, that's likely because, one house is split between several families in some instances. Demand is hugely, hugely subsidized. And so because of that, housing is hugely, hugely undersupplied, but over-demanded. So, I mean, the obvious fix is to just start building houses. But I mean, there's no profit. I mean, there's a huge profit motive to be had, right? Obviously, but there's also a huge profit motive to be had by just holding on to land because land value is so high because of this subsidized demand. It all links back to just huge demand subsidies, which is it's causing ridiculous housing costs. So yeah, I mean, ultimately what I'm saying is, I mean, home ownership is 57%. Almost every other bit of residency is private rent, and all of that is just because the government just keeps subsidizing demand, which has absolutely no benefits also, right? Because if you think about it, it's still costing the government money, but it's not extending supply, and it's not particularly helping in affordability because it's just pushing up house prices, you know? But once you start subsidizing demand, it's very difficult to get out of that situation, right? Because people are just going to want to continually buy houses, or they're going to continually want to take advantage of that scheme. If you start redirecting those funds to building new houses, suddenly people are going to be like, there's obviously that time lag of building new houses to make the housing market more affordable, right? So they're basically stuck in this system of continually subsidizing demand and never ever going to build state-run housing or anything like that. So I mean, Chile is probably never going to have decent social housing figures, and they're probably never going to break 60, 70% home ownership simply because of this subsidized demand. So, yeah, I mean, it's probably the worst country to live in for housing. Well, maybe not the worst, but one of the worst, especially because it's a developing country, right? They don't have like vast amounts of wealth to fall back onto. There's very little savings.
I think it's also partially because of their geography kind of being limiting, maybe.
Um, yeah, 50% of the population lives on the coast, for example.
Yeah, yeah. And then you have like the desert in the north, and then it's very mountainous on a lot of areas, and then there you can't do anything, so you already are kind of stuck with like the not so good geography for that.
Yeah, no, certainly, but I mean, the system certainly doesn't help, right? I mean, it's
Yeah,
almost
of course, of
like a
course.
double whammy of effects. You have subsidized
Mm,
demand and horrible geography for housing in general. Um, so then we
fair
move on to
point.
Austria. So I'll come back to Austria later also, because I compare it to the UK. Cause Austria and the UK have somewhat relatively similar systems. So Austria's home to 9.6 million people. Social housing accounts for 24% of all homes. But as Stan pointed out before we even started recording, Vienna is one of the most affordable cities in all of Europe, and 45% of their housing is social housing. And that's primarily because it's sort of privately built by these things that are called low profit housing associations. And by low profit, what they mean is they operate on a rent based, a cost rent basis. So rather than having their rent, be like, oh, like in the UK, for example, I'll explain this later, but I'll just give it as the example now. In the UK, we peg market social rents to market rents at about 80% of their value. So if you have a house that's like £1,000 a month, that's privately rented, and a social house right next to that, the social house will be like £800 a month because it's like pegged in value. It's meant to be like more affordable, but like relative to market value. Whereas Austria, what they do is that they do it on a cost rent basis. So like if they build it for a certain cost, they'll rent it at like a specific margin just above this cost. So what that means is it's actually hugely affordable because I mean if you think about renting, it's there's a huge profit margin most of the time because it's following market rates. Even though maybe 10, 20 years ago when the house was made, it cost significantly less than what the rent is for it now. And that's simply just because I mean as the economy naturally inflates, right? So by operating on a cost rent basis, it's incredibly affordable, but the companies that are building it are still like retaining profits. And because they're, as the name implies, a low profit housing association, a low profit housing association, they reinvest all of their profits into building new housing or maintaining current housing. So you don't really have the issue of low quality social housing, and you also don't have the issue of a limited supply of social housing. So just for example, they build 16,000 new homes annually across the entire country. A lot of this is centered in Vienna though, as also Vienna has like like there's some population disparity, right? Vienna grows at a far faster rate in terms of population than the rest of the country. I think some people joke that right, Austria is like a city state with a lot of land because I mean almost all of the economy is centered in Vienna and the rest of the country is just mountains. But yeah, so rents also go up in line with CPI inflation as well. So it's not like in the UK, for example, we have like I mean this is kind of an esoteric example, but we have for pensions we have a triple lock system where it will either there's like three different it'll either go up with CPI inflation 2.5% or wage growth, and whichever's highest it will go up with. Whereas this one it only goes up with CPI inflation, which generally wages go up higher then, but not necessarily true. And this is why post 2023 they capped it at 5%, and that's because the economy experienced, I mean everywhere in the world experienced this, but Austria especially, I think it was 20%, but was that huge hyperinflation of 2022 2023 where I mean, in the UK, right, for example, we had inflation as high as 14%. Most countries had double-digit inflation, which was absolutely insane, and wages obviously did not grow that fast. So for Austria, they capped it at 5%. So even if CPI is 6% or 7%, the rents will only go up 5%, and that also maintains that affordability. There's like something to be said about rent controls and how it can cause shortages because holy voice crack. Anyway, it causes shortages because there's like too much demand and not enough supply because of the rent cap. If you read Economics 101 by Thomas Sowell, he sort of goes into that. Got a bad book overall, but I mean it's a good example. So yeah, I mean, so 22 to 25% of income relatively goes towards rents. This is relative because the way that they obviously build houses is there's like sort of higher quality social housing and lower quality social housing, and a lot of people in social housing aren't necessarily just low income. They could also be middle income people. And so what happens is middle income earners will often pay higher rents because they're in that quote unquote higher quality social housing. So it sort of scales, but not like a Singaporean system where as you earn more, you pay more rent because of the state. It's more like as you earn more, naturally you're going to want better housing, and therefore you just pay higher rents, which is relative to income. So that's why there's like a 3% disparity. But yeah, I mean overall, 45% of Vienna being social housing is a huge accomplishment. And I mean, LPHAs are incredibly efficient, as you can tell by these staggering figures. And I'll get into more why they're so efficient compared to, for example, UK housing associations in a bit. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about Romania. Romania is, so I sort of chose Romania because Vienna is like sort of this shining example of an EU country that has very good social housing schemes, and Romania is the complete opposite. So 18.86 million people live in Romania, but of this population, only 2.6% live in social housing. But there's a 96% home ownership, which is staggering. That's eye-wateringly high. That's higher than Singapore. That's insane. That's one of the highest in the world. But there's a huge caveat to that, and that is that 40% of under 34s live with their parents. So this high ownership is mostly just because there's like this huge young population trying to get on a property ladder, but they can't. But there's no rent stock, so they just live with their parents, and that keeps that really high home ownership. I have some other figures here. I think the average age to leave home is 30, and there's only a 1.3% private rent stock, and most of that is centered in the urban population centers like Bucharest and Cluj. So there's also no inheritance tax as well, which certainly helps, right? So of the high ownership, houses are very easily passed down. And there's a very low population growth in Romania, so there's not like a huge demand growth compared to the supply. But the main reason for the high home ownership rate comes from their communist legacy. So when Romania transitioned from communism to capitalism in, I believe, 1990, it might be 1989, it was when the Iron Curtain fell. Basically, what happened is the government, who owned all the housing initially, and people would just pay into the government, they just sold off all the flats and all the housing at a massively reduced rate to the tenants. So it wasn't like a Russia situation where they were just selling it to the highest bidder. It was like a complete shock therapy situation. No, it was more like if you were a tenant of the house, you could buy the house at a very reduced rate, and so almost everyone immediately just became a homeowner. I mean, obviously a few people didn't, but the vast majority became homeowners because it was such a lucrative thing. But now because of that, right, you have this situation where there's not really any incentive to build new houses because there's such high home ownership, and people bought it at such a low cost. But now people are selling it at these, these new, it's adjusted now, right? Especially since they joined the EU, it's hugely adjusted. So you have some people selling their house now, and I mean obviously that's also sort of carved out this privately rented situation. And of the social housing, even though 2.6% is social housing, the vast majority is very low quality, and it's usually provisioned for refugees, disabled people, and like vulnerable people. And of this social housing, the vast majority is rented from private owners. So this is where this staggering figure comes from. 40% of income, with 20% of people in social housing spending 60% of their income on social housing rents because the government has to pay such high inflated rents to private owners for the social housing, which is then shifted onto the individual, which, as I said, are primarily like refugees, disabled, and vulnerable people who already have very, very low incomes. So it's called this situation where like 1 in 5 people in social housing are paying 60% and an average of 40% of their income. That's the highest of any country on this list, and probably one of the highest in the world. It's insane, insane situation. And I mean, yeah, right. It's just like very under provisioned social housing, which is almost like none of it is owned by the government, which would reduce costs because there's no like continual fixed costs from renting. You just you buy the house or you build the house, then it's just that, and then you can theoretically get some income from that. It's the opposite. They're continually losing income from social housing. So I mean, like Romania is just a very, very bad example. I mean, they sort of have this huge benefit of the high home ownership, so they don't necessarily need social housing. But of those vulnerable, disabled people, etc., who have to live in the low quality, privately rented social housing, it's a horrible situation, right? You have to think for this minority that's being like very negatively affected by this high home ownership system, which doesn't account for this minority.
Not specifically to Romania. It's like this is a very sad situation.
Mm,
With like up to 60% being spent on houses, on housing, on like rent. That's like kind of devastating. I can speak a bit. Maybe now is a good time to chirp in with a bit of Germany's stuff because
mm,
I specifically I come from East Germany originally, and I looked a bit on statistics, maybe to share a bit. In Germany, in general, home ownership is very low, the percentage rate, um, compared to other EU countries. Um, Around 46 to 47% of people own their own houses, which is like lower, like, lower than 50%. And while the EU average is like around 68 to 70%, in Germany it's incredibly low. But now to compare like what I originally wanted to do, East and West Germany, because East Germany is more in a unique position than Romania, where Romania just stayed its own country. East Germany got absorbed by a Western country, right?
mm.
Um, so in West Germany, the percentage is 45 to 47% of people own their own houses, while in East Germany it's 30 to 35%. This is incredibly low, and a huge reason for the divide between the two like regions in Germany. In general, the regions are still very divided to this day on a lot of stuff. But after reunification, what happened is a lot of West German companies bought out stuff in East Germany, especially in the cities, right? In Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, like East Berlin, and as well as they checked who owned the property before the wall fell, and sometimes the houses would go to West Germans and they rented in East Germany. So East Germany is really low compared to West Germany, which is kind of a sad situation to be in for the country.
Yeah. Like I mean, a lot of it stems from that, like as I have here, this communist transition legacy.
Mhm.
Obviously West like the German unification had this like capitalist rush, whereas Romania had this sort of immediate transition from. I mean, it was already. I mean, well, the people never owned their homes in the communist system. They just sort of paid
Yeah.
rent into the government, and so
Mhm.
immediately you had this home ownership. You didn't have this capitalist rush because you didn't have this pre-established, hugely rich, wealthy capitalist population who could take advantage of that. But I mean, equal situation, right? Where you have this small minority of people who just got like really, really ruined by the whole situation. And sort of building on this point, right? I mean, you have to think 60% of income going towards rents on social housing of this vulnerable population who probably also need things like healthcare. Who a lot of them might have to transition to private healthcare because I mean Romania's public healthcare system isn't the best. Obviously, there's also like food costs and transport costs and all of that, right? It's horrible, horrible situation for those vulnerable populations who really need social housing, and it's a big failure on the government to not have built much social housing. But again, right, it's like a Chile situation where so much is being put into subsidizing rents from or paying rents from private landlords alongside people paying rent into social housing, where it's like you can't really free up money to start building housing unless you just, increase taxes or find money from elsewhere to start building housing to reduce these social housing costs and reduce these rent costs for social housing. It's sort of a, yeah, again, as I said, a Chile situation. It's very difficult to get out of. But moving on, Japan. So I've got Japan and the UK lined up now. These are the two like large economies, which are very interesting. So Japan actually is a very similar situation to Singapore. In terms of their income, you have 20 to 25% of their income, and that scales as you get more income, it charges more. And obviously 122.8 million people. So that 5% of housing being social seems very low, but when you put it in proportion of the million population, it's actually probably about the same amount as Singapore. Actually, it is. So you have, but because of the way Japan is, you have this huge urban center in Tokyo and these other places. But you also have a huge rural population, especially in the north. So there's a huge regional variance in Tokyo. Some boroughs in Tokyo. You have boroughs where you have like 10% of the population living in social housing, but then you have rural areas where there's less than 1% of people live in social housing. And that's also predominantly because of employers often offering rents. So in Japan, this is very unique to Japan. Although there's probably some other countries that do this. Where what happens is you'll become employed by a company, and this company, while doing what they usually do, they also own a huge housing stock. And what they'll do is they'll offer employees to live in their housing at massively reduced rent costs. And what happens is the need for social housing is massively reduced because there's also this huge private sector that uses low rent housing owned by the company in order as like an extra bonus for the employee, just because it's a vastly wealthy country which isn't really growing anymore. And so there's a lot of wealth just stored up, not necessarily in housing. Housing in Japan, because of factors that I'll get into in a bit, housing doesn't really appreciate in value also. In fact, they often depreciate. So the need for social housing in Japan is very, very low. And a lot of the social housing in Japan is provided to people on extremely low incomes, elderly people, or single parents. And so often a lot of social housing is just, because there's a huge vulnerable population in Japan because of their aging demographics, because of their push for more birth rates, which has inevitably led to a surprisingly high amount of single parents and things like that. So a lot of social housing is genuinely for the vulnerable and not necessarily just for low incomes, who, as I said, benefit from employer social housing. And they also have this thing called the URA, the Urban Renaissance Agency, who operate about 750,000 social houses. That's almost all of the social housing in the country. And so they were founded in 1955 in response to the post-war shortage of housing because of the huge fire bombings and the economic recovery, which also saw how like house prices hugely inflate in price. So there was a need for supply, and obviously population grew rapidly. So they operate most social housing. So most social housing is government run. It's not privately rented, despite the fact that private rents are actually a large proportion of Japan. But as I explained, that is mostly because of employer rents, not private rents. But Japan, as I was just explaining with the house depreciation, Japan is unique in that it has a shrinking population. So demand for housing is actually very slowly contracting, unlike in other countries where generally demand for housing just continually grows up because you have people earning more income and you have people you have the population growing, so there's just a natural increase in demand for housing. Japan doesn't have this issue, right? The wages are mostly stagnant and the population is shrinking. So housing depreciates. And I saw some studies where house prices depreciate 50% in 10 years. So if you buy a house and then you own it or you're paying off this mortgage, 10 years later, the house is worth 50% of what it was before. So you're sort of getting scammed in a way. But I mean, that's also probably one of the reasons for the high private rent percentage, but low social housing percentage. And that's just because there's not really it's just not logical to buy a house when it just depreciates. It's not a wealth driving asset. Although Japan is unique in that a lot of people own, for example, government bonds. So there is actually a huge amount of wealth, just not in housing, which sort of sets it apart from the West, where most people, their biggest asset in wealth is their house. But they have a 61% home ownership rate, and obviously 34% is privately rented. But in like urban areas like Tokyo, there's extremely high land prices just because of like the huge amount of development and high rises and things like that. So that also sort of exacerbates the renting issue where it's very difficult to buy a house. So again, people just naturally move to renting. And the 61% home ownership is mostly from the legacy of that Japanese economic boom where people were getting huge wages and actually owning a house was a smart decision and an economically viable decision, which is just no longer the case really. But I mean, yeah, and also of their social housing is similar to Singapore, right? Although Singapore's a city state, so they have to build up and have flats and not houses. Japan is different in that, as I've explained, most social housing is in urban areas. So it is sort of a Singapore situation where almost all social housing is mostly rental flats rather than actual houses. But I mean, it's just interesting, right? When you think of social housing, you don't necessarily think of just like government-owned, huge block flats. But that's the sort of the angle that the URA did, where they just built huge flats because it's the most affordable, and when you have extremely high land prices, it's just the most economically viable thing. When land is so expensive that it's impossible to build horizontally, you sort of have to build vertically. So their social housing is very unique in that fact, and is, I mean, very aligned with Singapore. And again, as I said with the income thing, right? It's very, there's a lot of parallels between Japan and Singapore. Just very different home ownership rates, and that's mostly because of demographics and mostly just because of like historical context.
I mean, Japan is a pretty unique case, I guess, with that, because it's actually kind of very interesting that the fact that it's not really worth it to own your own house in a country, uh,
Hmm.
as you stated, that's really unique. I feel like that's
Yeah.
like a pretty unique case, and especially in Japan, you wouldn't like. I personally, I don't know much about the topic, but I wouldn't have thought about that. That's the way it is in Japan. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, they also have like this cultural thing where houses are only really built for a generation, and then people would
mm.
inherit the land but demolish the house and build a new house. So it's also sort of a cultural thing. But
Ah,
even then,
okay.
people would own the land, right? That doesn't really happen anymore. And as I said, that's because of hugely high land prices but depreciating house values.
Yeah, because Japan has a huge population on like these small islands, comparatively small islands. Especially that it's also like it has a lot of mountains and stuff where a lot of the land you can't really build on, like parts of it.
Yeah.
And then it's all the population like kind of like a lot of it's a lot of Japan's population is in Tokyo. It's the biggest city on earth, so it centers around
Actually
that.
recently got overtaken by Jakarta in Indonesia.
Oh, it actually got overtaken. Okay, I didn't know that. Okay,
Yeah.
I
That was a very
that's my bad.
recent event, but yeah, I mean, it's still. I mean, I believe Tokyo has a population of 34 million. That's still insanely huge, and its location in being one of the only areas on the Japanese island where there isn't mountains and everything, so it can have that huge urban sprawl is the reason for that huge concentration in the capital. Like a
It,
quarter of the population living in the capital is already insane.
hmm, it actually got overtaken this year. I just googled. It
Yeah.
was this year. Okay, I didn't hear about that. It's,
Yeah, no, I only learned about that a couple months ago. Yeah, Jakarta's now the biggest in Indonesia.
mm,
So moving on to the UK. So this is sort of, as I explained at the start of the episode, this is the big crux, the big conclusion that I'm getting to. So the UK is a country home to 69.74 million people, and 17% of the housing is social, which is actually very, very low compared to these other countries we've looked at. And again, there's high regional variance, not to the Japan extent where you have rural areas where there's like less than 1%, but sort of urban areas which are like above 10%. There's like like a 10, like an order of magnitude of difference. In the UK, you have rural areas where the social housing is like 10%, and London boroughs where the amount of social housing exceeds 25%, but I don't believe there's anywhere that exceeds 30%. And that's huge because in the 1980s, pre-Thatcher, social housing made up over 30% of all housing stock. So the fact that even in the highest social housing areas in the entire country, we're still not back to our 1980s pre-Thatcher levels. I mean, that speaks volumes to the fact that the effect of the buy-to-let scheme and the mass privatization that happened in the UK. So, as I explained earlier, social rents are pegged to market rates. So I mean, this is roughly 80%. Sometimes it can be lower. It never exceeds 80% though. So, as I explained, if you have a privately rented house on a street, that's £1,000 a month, and then next to that you have a social house, it's at most going to be £800 a month. And like Austria, however, a lot of social housing isn't led by like state operations, like in Japan or Singapore. We're like the Urban Renaissance Agency. In the UK, we have housing associations, much like Austria, where they had the low profit housing associations. So housing associations roughly provide 60% of all social housing stock, while councils provide another 40%, although councils don't tend to build many houses anymore. So, that figure of housing associations is going to continually eat into the councils. Although I know there's some cases where councils will buy houses off of housing associations, although that's becoming rarer and rarer, especially as, councils continually get squeezed in funding. And then obviously, as it says here, 25 to 30% of income goes towards social housing costs, which isn't as bad as Romania, but it's on the higher end, right? It's higher than Japan or Singapore, which are, equally as rich, if not richer countries with higher wages. So yeah, but it's about comparable to Chile, for example, where it was, I think 27%. So, a very, very surprisingly high income, and this is like very, very bad for the country, and as I get into, primarily because of the way that housing associations are operated. So moving on to this then. So the context between UK versus Austria. So the UK Housing Association generally operates at a £5 billion surplus. This is taking figures from 2022 to 2023, whereas the Austrian Housing Association operates at an annual surplus of 395 million. And now both of them cannot retain these profits. They both have to be reinvested into housing, right? So you'd think, the UK Housing Association makes they make 10 times, if not more, in surplus than the Austrian housing associations. They should be building way more houses, right? And they do build more houses. UK housing associations in 2021, for example, built 38,000 homes compared to the Austrian housing associations, who built 16,000 homes in the same year. So, they built more than double the amount of homes. However, adjust this, first of all, to the amount of retained surpluses. That doesn't make sense. They should be building 10 times more homes. And now adjust it to the population. The UK is 7.2 times the population of Austria, but they're only building 2.4 times the amount of social housing. Right? It's just fundamentally, it doesn't make sense. They're earning more money. There's a higher population, so there's clearly a higher demand for homes as well. But they're just, it's nowhere near the productive capacity of Austria, right? Austria's productive capacity, 7.2 divided by 2.4, it is roughly 3 times that of the UK. So why is their productive capacity so high? Sort of in this context, I explain a little bit. So UK housing associations are loan driven through banks. So a lot of them are private lenders, which are far higher interest rates compared to Austrian housing associations, which often use like public loans and government subsidies that help to, lower the cost of these loans. And on top of it, there's things like housing bonds. So housing associations in Austria will issue bonds, which are also generally lower interest compared to UK ones. I believe housing association bonds in Austria, they vary between 1% to 3% compared to the interest rate in the UK, which is 4%, and oftentimes when you get a loan, it's even higher than that. So yeah, I mean, like there's this stark similarity in that they both use housing associations, but this stark difference in the way that these housing associations are funded. And this is why I'm getting into why is Austria just better, right? It's a very similar system. It's significantly better. And so Austrian housing associations buy public land from the government compared to UK housing associations who don't have this. And why is this? This is because of a right to buy scheme. In the UK, during the Thatcherite government, a lot of council land and council housing was just sold off. So fundamentally, there's a very huge lack of public land. So what happens is now housing associations in the UK have to pay a market rate, which is already hugely inflated because of things like speculation and these other things, right? So land prices are already hugely expensive, and they can never be bought for below market rate. So even in like Austria, right, they've had equal issues with land speculation and land prices, but the government still retains a lot of land, and so what they can do is the government can sell the land to housing associations for a significantly lower cost. If you look at the UK, the land can cost up to 60% of the total cost of building a house. And so that's a huge barrier to entry compared to the Austrian housing associations, which can buy public land at a massively reduced rate and with tax breaks and things like that because they work in tandem with the government. So there's already a huge barrier to entry which the UK suffers from compared to Austria. And on top of this, because of the private loans that UK housing associations have, they pay a higher interest rate on their debt compared to the Austrian housing associations, which obviously issue bonds and may benefit from loan subsidies. So not only do you have higher barriers to entry, you also have just like more of their surplus that they earn from the rents going back towards debt servicing rather than actual reinvestment. And so then on top of this, UK subsidies from the government, right? So the government, it's not like housing associations are completely left to their own devices. The government does give grants, right? But depending on the type of, so for example, under the Tory government, they massively reduced grants to housing associations. And what this has caused is there's huge fluctuations in the grants. So there's not consistency. So you can't really plan ahead. And because of that, sometimes housing associations will get these huge, like stipends from the government. And they'll be like, oh, great, we have all this money, we can go build housing. And then the next year they don't have it anymore, so they'll massively have to cut back on their operations. And because housing can sometimes take more than a year to build, you have these fund gaps where housing isn't necessarily always finished or it's built to a subpar standard, and because of that, it can't be registered as social housing because of regulation and things like that, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, of course. You want proper housing, but I mean, ultimately, it's a failure on the government for not providing consistent subsidies compared to the Austrian model, where the government consistently gives out like fair subsidies, and a lot of it is in ratio to like the housing market, right? So the Austrian government, especially the local municipalities, because it's not a centrally led thing, it's based on local municipalities. They'll look at the housing market, and if there's if rents are rising massively, they'll adjust accordingly and subsidize more and allow the full funding to like not the full funding. They don't give complete subsidies. As I said, the Austrian model still does take loans out, but again at a massively reduced rate. And because the government actually pays attention to the housing market, a lot of the time the projects are actually finished or they get the proper funding, unlike these and obviously the debt is massively reduced because of the subsidies paying that off. So the housing association themselves can focus on building the house rather than trying to retain a profit to pay off the debt. And this is why we have this big issue in the UK with social housing accessibility. 40% of housing associations in the UK, or 40% of housing association surpluses in the UK go to debt repayments, and the need for a consistent income to pay off these debts means that low-income households often miss out. You'll apply for a social house and then be told you have too low of an income, which just doesn't make sense because a social house is meant to be someone with a low income. And that's just because a housing association needs a good income to pay off the debt because the government doesn't fund them properly. And so you have this massive issue where people on low incomes can't afford a social house and people on middle incomes can afford a social house, but also because it's somewhat means tested, they're too wealthy to be able to get a social house. So you just have this gap in the market, and it's not like social housing aren't being populated, but it's not going towards people on low incomes, and it's not necessarily generating a good enough profit for housing associations to generate a good enough surplus to pay for the high land prices and to service all of the debt so that they can actually generate a really good surplus like the Austrian model where they can just build. And so that's why the Austrian model has 3 times the productive capacity compared to the UK. So, I mean, if the UK didn't have the buy-to-let scheme, first of all, social housing would probably still be about 30 to 40% of the housing stock in the UK, and we probably have a lot more houses because the barriers to entry wouldn't be there, and the high debt costs wouldn't necessarily be there because the government might actually pay attention to social housing. And I mean, yeah, that's it.
So I'm trying to understand this more here. Um, a lot of the reasons Austria's system is better is because the UK government and the way that their laws work based on buying land are blocking the housing associations from actually being able to buy the land.
Um, so
From
no, so what it is in Austria, the Austrian
Mhm.
municipalities and government, they own land. The government actually
Yeah.
owns land. In the
Mhm.
UK, the government owns very, very little land, and of the land it does own, it's often bought back from the market. Because in the UK
Mhm.
we had this buy-to-let scheme and we had privatization in the 80s where a lot of land was sold off. And so
Okay.
because of that, the government doesn't retain any land. That in Austria, the government does retain land, so they can sell land to housing associations
Okay.
really cheaply. In the UK, they just can't do that. And so the housing associations have to buy land off of private owners who are going to sell at market rate, which is hugely inflated because of things like speculation or because of things like, they just want profit. Unlike the government who doesn't want profit, they want results.
Okay. I see. Okay.
So yeah. So to sum up this episode, right? The UK faces a huge issue with social housing in that there's an underprovision of social housing, and the social housing we do have is hugely inaccessible for the low income people and the vulnerable people who need it because of the fact that they need to service the debt and there's high barriers to entry to build more houses to get those economies of scale to have a huge income from rents. And so, ultimately, the failure of UK social housing is the mass privatization of social housing. So yeah, thank you for watching.